I just want to tell you that one of the reasons that initially I was very skeptical about UFOs, one of the things that absolutely convinced me was working in the rural areas. I worked with a team who were on a project in Africa where we were giving simple technology to the women in the very backward areas. And I came across a particular case there where there were 20 witnesses, and they'd seen a ball of fire rolling across a lawn, and eventually, I won't go into details, it's too complicated, but eventually there were 3 men in shiny suits. Well, they actually said shiny, and I was eventually able to obtain the information that the suits were in silver. And the only reason I found out because they spoke Muchena. They're the Muchena tribe from Zimbabwe, eastern Zimbabwe. And the reason that they were able to tell me was because one of the gentlemen took a 20-cent coin from his pocket, so that I realized the suits were silver. They could only describe it as shiny. And I said, what did you think they were? And this group said, they were the spirits of our ancestors. And I said, but surely the spirits of your ancestors wore furs and lion teeth and monkey bands around their heads and so forth, which they did. And this guy I was talking to thought for a little while, and he said, you know, times change. So, but this one particular case convinced me, and it's happening continually, where I now have, since the War of Independence is over, and since I have access to these remote areas in Africa, where I speak to the people, and they keep on telling me about these things who come down from the sky, and I can tell you they're not American helicopters.
Well, I think the main thing to bear in mind is the fact that most of the black people are not exposed to the media as such. Not that we don't have radio and television, we do, but we don't get UFO coverage. I think they're a little bit superstitious about it, and so we don't get much from programs here in the UK or even in America telling them. So they're virtually, although they have lots of radio programs, they don't know about UFOs. So when I get a report of any consequence that I follow through, they don't realize we're dealing with UFOs. And at one time, I think it was John Spencer, he made a point that I had told them they were seeing UFOs. That's not true, because I don't lead the witnesses at all. The particular one you're referring to was a fellow called Clifford Muchena, who was one of a group of 20 workmen at a forestry estate, and a man who was one of the bosses there phoned me up, and he was a white man, and he said to me, did I know that they had, some of his workers had seen a UFO? Well, I didn't know, but I went out immediately. It was about 300 miles away, and I drove. I had to stay overnight and interviewed them all, and I just said, tell me your story. And the interesting thing was that they had seen a ball of light rolling across the lawns. It had rolled up a wall and burst into flame, and Clifford Muchena, who was one of the more responsible workers, had run to ring a bell, which was kept there for an emergency. While he was ringing the bell, this ball of flame gathered together, climbed down the wall. Well, they used the expression walked down the wall, went past behind him, and burst into flame again in another place. And when this happened, he was aware of 3 figures standing there. So he quickly ran towards them, thinking that one of them was Andrew Connolly, who was his immediate boss. And he was shouting, Mr. Connolly, to tell him what had happened, when the 3 figures turned around in unison, but slowly. And when they faced him, he saw this brilliant light emanating from the heads, and it was like a power, because he fell to the ground. And I said, but they were 3 meters away from you, about 10 feet. How come you fell to the ground? And he said their power was so strong. Now, when he described them to me, he said they had shiny suits. And you might remember that I told you there's no word in Muchena, which is their language, for the word silver. So when I wanted him to be more explicit, he took a coin out of his pocket silver coin, and he said that was what they were wearing. And then I said, Clifford, who did you think they were? And he said, I knew who they were. They were my ancestors, the ghosts of my ancestors. And I said, but your ancestors wore fur and monkey skins and lion's teeth. They didn't wear silver suits. And he thought for a bit, and then he said, well, times change.
It's a lovely story. Cynthia. The remarks you made earlier clearly imply that contamination, for want of a better term, could well play a serious part in the nature of the stories that we get in the West. I mean, clearly science fiction has, I think, played a big influencing part. I think you've got a big advantage that there doesn't seem to be that kind of influence.
No.
Why, though, do you think the natives that you've dealt with think of the kind of events that we regard as UFOs as visits from their ancestors?
Well, that's what they relate to. That's part of their culture. You know, they have several sort of ghost figures in their culture, in the folklore, certainly of Zimbabwe, which I know well. One of them is if you don't, like for instance, if you died in England and you were in a Zimbabwean and they buried you in the ground and they didn't put your head pointing towards your home, you would haunt them because you were not satisfied that you were facing where you lived. And then you might get another ghost who feels that he's been badly done by the tribe, and he will come and haunt. But you also get good ghosts who come with good news. They have a variety of supernatural beings who appear, so that ghosts are not offensive necessarily to the African people, and they accept this, but they don't know anything about. In fact, when I said, after we had discussed the whole thing, and I said, have you ever thought it might be anything else? And they said, what do you mean? And I said, well, you know, man has now gone to the moon. There might be, for want of a better way to describe it, there might be people living up in the stars there in the skies. And they said, what do you mean, on the moon? So I said, yes, man has been to the moon. And they said, oh no, only God walks on the moon. So you see, the whole concept is totally different from the way we would look at it.